FPS stands for frames per second. This is essentially the amount of images that your hardware can render per second. On Roblox, this is hard capped at 60 frames per second without any modifications. Why? Well, Roblox prefers to reach 60 frames per second on the most devices possible rather than getting the most frames per second out of each device. Roblox is not a graphically intensive game, or for the most part. Most people on Roblox probably have a low-end PC or are even using phones from about 6 years ago, so getting the highest amount of frames per second is not of the utmost concern to these people. Quite honestly, 60 frames per second is the most that anybody will need. Your monitor probably only has a refresh rate of about 60 Hz, so removing the cap of 60 frames per second is not going to benefit you for the most part. Even for me, YouTube can only support up to 60 frames per second, so having a higher refresh rate would not benefit these videos, even if my graphics card and my monitor could support higher frames per second. So why bother with this experiment? Well, I guess it's for fun. I mean, you could see it as informative, but the results will vary between systems. For context, I have a Ryzen 7 5800X and NVIDIA RTX 3070 Ti graphics card. So, I am more than capable of running higher refresh rates on Roblox. However, your system probably can't. Now, to actually achieve higher refresh rates on Roblox, you need to download this FPS unlocker I'll have the link in the description actually. As you can see in the corner right now, my frames per second is calmly at 60. Now, let's see what happens when we enable this.
A few moments later.
Now, after I unlock my FPS, you can see that my frames per second are anywhere between 300 to 400. While in the lobby, I think the highest frames per second I achieved was about 420. When you're doing different tasks, obviously the frames per second would decrease depending on how graphically intensive it is. I mean, as you can see right now, I'm getting about 800 FPS. That's just because the game's loading. In normal gameplay, you can clearly see that I'm getting around 200 frames per second. However, as you can see, my graphics setting is at 10, so what happens if we were to decrease this to 1? As you can see, my frames per second has now increased dramatically to about 480, which is near enough to 500 to cause this to be a major increase. Obviously the game looks less nice, but I mean, you know, higher frames per second, can you complain? However, what happens if we were to end the game right now? How much FPS would we get? Actually, not as much as a dramatic increase as I thought it would be. Although, actually, you can see now that after I sold all my towers, I'm getting about 600 FPS sometimes. So between about 500 to 600 FPS. However, what happens if we were to use FreeCam to zoom all the way out into the stratosphere? Would this actually increase our FPS?
To infinity and beyond!
Actually, you can see that we're sometimes getting 1000 FPS if we look into the sky. If we were to look down, yeah, we would decrease back down to about 400. Oh, actually, 1200. 1300 I just saw. Yeah, so you get about 1,300 by zooming out into the sky. Weirdly, looking up at the sun causes the frames to go back down to about 130. And looking straight ahead gets my frames back down to about 60. I don't know why. But then looking at the base plate, while it's not flickering, gets 1,200 FPS. I don't know why either. Yeah, so about 1,200 FPS is the highest you can get in this map alone. So 1,200 FPS is the record to beat. What happens if I was to choose a game that is what I think is less graphically intensive? Now with Spring Fever, the reason why I chose this is because there's no terrain water. I think this may be why it's high. The frames per second is higher than what was seen in Autumn Falling, but you know, you can never be sure. But I mean, like right now, I'm getting nearly 700 FPS, while in Autumn Falling I was getting around, you know, 500, 600. But once again, best results are when there's nothing in play. So, selling all my towers, what is the highest FPS that we can get on this map? Oh, I'm getting about 1,400. 1,490 I'm seeing. What happens if I was to go back down though, instead of going back up? As you can see, sometimes I'm getting 1,500, although when I tried this before, sometimes I got 1,600. I think OBS also causes the frames per second to drop because without it recording right now, it's at around 1,600. So maybe that's why I wasn't seeing 1,600 before, but now I am. Yeah, so as you can see, 1,600. When I press record, drops down to about 1,400. So OBS does affect the frames per second seen. Now I am aware that if you get like a better graphics card, say 3090 Ti, you could probably achieve higher frame rates. However, I'm not here to do that. I'm just here to see, with my system, 3070 Ti, what's the highest frames that you can get in Tower Defense Simulator. And I can get around 1,600, give or take. Am I going to take advantage of a 1,000 FPS game? No, of course not. That's because my monitor can only refresh at about 144 Hz. Actually, I just thought of one more thing. What happens if my window for Roblox was smaller? Would that improve FPS? Doing the same thing as before, can we see an improvement in FPS? Yeah, we can. While this recording is up, I'm getting about 1,600 FPS. Now obviously this is with OBS on, which affects performance, so if we were to get rid of the OBS recording, we can see we're getting about 1,800 FPS, which, you know, quite impressive. So there you have it, highest FPS that I can achieve, 1,800. Someone can probably achieve higher if they tried, but you know, you can go try.